Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another live edition of the Everything Compliance Podcast. Today we have the quartet of Matt Kelly, Jonathan Marks, Lisa Fine, and Dr. Emma Lomax. We're going to start with Matt. Matt, what is on your mind this week?
We are going to start with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act because we have an FCPA enforcement action, like a real one with criminal penalties and the DPA and the chief compliance officer certifying the program and all that fun stuff, just like old times. We saw that last week from the Trump administration, and it's newsworthy because at the start of the year, we all thought that the FCPA would not be enforced. Then they came out with more constrained guidelines about FCPA enforcement in June, where they said that we're probably not going to do this unless it's some very narrow circumstances, including whether the enforcement action for FCPA violations somehow involves drug cartels. And this one did. So I don't know the last time we ever saw something like that with FCPA. But this just reminds us that, at least in theory, the FCPA is still alive and kicking. I'm not sure if it will kick again, but it might. So the background here is that the company in question is Millicom Tigo. So Millicom is a telecommunications firm that is headquartered in London, and it does business throughout the Caribbean and Latin America, with U.S. headquarters in Florida, right down the street from Mar-a-Lago, if I remember correctly. And they were caught up in an FCPA investigation involving a joint venture partner known as Comcel in Guatemala. So Comcel had originally been the state-owned telecommunications company in Guatemala that was run by a government minister by the name of Mario Estrada, who was ultimately ended up being the richest man in Guatemala. He passed away in 2023 at the age of 84. But anyways, Comcel was then spun out, and Mr. Estrada became the head of that firm and various other Guatemalan and Latin American businesses. And he was the joint venture partner for Millicom. So this new business, Millicom Tigo, the one big lesson here for compliance officers is talk about a terrible joint venture structure that leaves you at a disadvantage. So Millicom owned 55% of this joint venture with the newly independent Comcel. However, despite being a majority owner, it had no operational control or really any transparency into what Comcel on the ground was doing in Guatemala. Throughout the 2010s, it was bribing Guatemalan officials like something out of a Tom Clancy novel. There were bags of cash being flown around the country in private helicopter until the bags of cash in the helicopter had to make an emergency landing at a military base in Guatemala, where they were seen. The base commander reported that to authorities. An investigation opened. So Mr. Estrada and several other of his associates, they wound up thinking that they need a new way to launder money and get bribes. They wound up getting their bribe money from a bank in Guatemala that had been laundering drug proceeds from cartels in the country. So the bribery money that Estrada and the JV partner Comcel were paying to the government officials, that actual cash was drug proceeds that had been laundered by the bank. So there's our cartel connection. And like I said, this goes on and on. The interesting thing is that Millicom eventually self-disclosed this in 2015. The Justice Department decided in 2018, we're not going to prosecute. Thank you for self-disclosing. But despite all of that, Millicom still didn't have any operational control or visibility into what Comcel was doing on the ground, and they kept on bribing. It wasn't until Millicom took over all of Comcel in 2022 that they realized the full scope of this. By then, the Justice Department had heard other news of continued corruption there, reopened the case, which I have not heard of before, that they closed the case and then reopened an FCPA investigation. That's the settlement that we just had, was from that reopened case in 2022. Ultimately, $60 million criminal penalty, $58 million in disgorged profits, 2-year deferred prosecution agreement, which I guess is kind of sort of good because typically it's three. Millicom did win a lot of praise from the Justice Department for all of its compliance efforts since 2022. But I mean, I think the big takeaways here are, number one, the overlap with drug cartel proceeds. Number two, the DOJ reopening a case, which I hadn't heard of. Number three, the tremendously bad position that Millicom had been in with this joint venture. Like, what did you think was going to happen here, folks? And it happened throughout the 2010s. I guess it's good news that Millicom took a whole lot of proactive measures from 22 onward to build a better compliance program, but they really suffered a lot and all along the way here. My last big point is simply that, will we see more FCPA enforcement like this in the future? I don't know how often drug cartels and corporate corruption overlap at the same time. I don't even know if there are these cases and allegations out there. But everybody who thought we would not see FCPA enforcements again, here's one example of it. But I don't know if this is an echo from prior FCPA enforcements or a precursor of what to come. The very last detail, however, is this would be a great time for the Justice Department to give a speech to tell us what it's thinking. Lo and behold, right after Thanksgiving, on December 3rd, I think it is, the acting head of the criminal division will be giving a speech at the FCPA compliance conference that is happening in Washington, D.C. I can't imagine he won't talk about this case. Like, why else would you be there? I'll be very curious to see what he actually says. But it's, like I said, it's a crazy fact pattern. It's a whole bunch of lessons learned. It's quite something. Tom, if you have a question, you are on mute.
Mr. Marks, do you have a question or comment?
No, I think the whole case is pretty interesting, and sort of the trajectory here is interesting as well. And Matt, I know you wrote about it. I wrote about it as well. I thought I took a little bit different twist. I was looking at this from the compliance program perspective,
Yep.
from a root cause perspective. And, one of the things that I think I pointed out in my writing was that, the compliance program actually existed outside the environment where the risk lived. And if you look at Millicom, they could not access ComCell systems. They couldn't test high-risk transactions. They could not investigate directly. They could not enforce its policies. They could not validate remediation. They could not. So, this was sort of a recipe for disaster at the start of all this. So it's kind of interesting. But I think the other message that I think that I was trying to articulate, again, not only that, but a well-written compliance program. I think I said this. If not, somebody correct me. But I think I said this in my writing, was a well-written compliance program cannot overcome a structure that blocks visibility. And the board can't fulfill its oversight responsibilities when access is denied. So, a joint venture that limits transparency becomes truly a governance blind spot. And, I really like what you put together. And I think, it really it made me think more about why did this happen? And so, I think there's some great learning lessons here for boards, and, challenging management to answer very, very tough questions. And the boards really need to really step up here and really ask those tough questions. But that structural oversight thing, to me, was really something that resonated. And I'm just curious as, whether the good doctor or Lisa have, any further insights into this, because it is kind of an interesting case all in itself. But I think from a lessons learned perspective, I mean, it really is interesting how they viewed compliance and how compliance actually was marshaled out within the organization.
One question I had was just at that governance strategic level, like, who thought this was a good idea? I mean,
don't know.
If we want to be cynical, I suppose if you were going into China and you were going to get 1 billion users and make boatloads of money, then maybe you want to cut compliance off budgets and resources. But like, with all due respect to any Guatemalans who might be listening, Guatemala is not a large market, and you took this kind of a risk for that kind of return. That was the thing. If I were a board director, I would have just been asking that.
And I want to pick up on Jonathan's point because I have a question for him and Lisa. Have you guys ever faced this sort of situation where your management didn't understand the need to have visibility into? I'm not saying you had to have control over a joint venture because that's a separate business negotiation, but were you able to explain or at least educate on the need for transparency or visibility into the JV?
I can comment on that. Look, I never had that situation myself, thankfully, but I can tell you I can have a lot of empathy for how this can come about inadvertently. And I think that's something we need to be watching out for as compliance professionals, that, Matt, you're right, the government's right to wonder if this was intentional, but all too often it's inadvertent because we're moving at the speed of business and compliance isn't keeping up. And so, yes, you're right, Tom, those are the messages that compliance would want to be getting across, but do they even know what's happening everywhere in the company? Are they even aware there was a joint venture? And that seems like a silly basic question, but in my experience, the real job is making sure you're in the room where it happens, that you are getting advance notice of these things. And it's, policies telling people to tell you is not enough, right? We know this. So having this mandate that you should put us in the room, no one's going to disagree with that. But actually, in practical reality, that's just not going to happen until you systematically find a way into the room. So I can give you an example of what our listeners can maybe think about there. I like to talk about objective-centered risk management. Again, nice catchphrase. What does that mean? It means track where the company is going and build your risk program around the objectives of the program. What does that mean? Now you have to find out when they're doing that, right? And you have to be involved in this conversation. So for example, AOP planning, right? OKR planning. You do not want to be doing your risk assessments the year after that stuff has started. You need to be in those rooms on day one, ask the right questions. What's our acquisition strategy? What's on the horizon? And explain to people why we need to be there and help at that time. I don't know. I'm not into the case. I haven't read the details. I obviously didn't work there. But I've got a hunch that it's not that they didn't want compliance involved. They just didn't systematically have compliance entrenched in these decisions. What about you, Lisa? What do you think?
Well, I same with you. I think there's some empathy to those when these are large organizations. I think that one of the other points to keep in mind, and Matt, you mentioned when you said, Guatemala is not a huge market. Those things are often seen as less risky by the some senior levels of organizations because they think low revenue, therefore lower problem. And we can handle it externally. You put in cultural challenges in these places where for a joint venture, or there are times where you'll do an acquisition and you're like, let's bring them into the culture of the company in a way that makes sense and makes it work. And there's not a bad intention on all of that. So I think that some of that to be keeping in mind, I think from your compliance program is keep an eye on the places where you're not as comfortable that other people may be looking at it. Know about those joint ventures more maybe than one that might happen in the United States, which not only is a larger market for most companies. I mean, I don't want to insult all Guatemalan companies either on this, but I think it is really important to keep that in mind, that these things become higher risk in a way in which, frankly, sometimes the business doesn't understand. And if you are a small function, sometimes, how are you going to know every time there's a joint venture? So I think there's a lot of those things to keep in mind, both education, reality, and with our limited resources, sometimes it makes more sense to look at the smaller spots for exactly those points.
And we fought this battle. Most of us fought this battle when Sarbanes-Oxley came into play.
Yeah.
When they started talking about building control environments, it's like, well, the revenue's insignificant. Why should we care about it, right?
Yeah.
And look what happened with that. I mean, it turned into for a lot of folks, it turned into a nightmare.
It's a good reminder about the difference between materiality for SOX and materiality for EPA. That yes, Guatemala is not a large risk in dollars, but highly corrupt country. And your head of the joint venture was literally a foreign government official in one of that highly, like the corruption risk for this was sky high, even though Guatemala was small. And look at where we are.
Yeah.
And trust is not a control. Sorry.
I'll remember that. Dr. Lomax, what do you have for us, or what's been on your mind?
Well, it won't surprise you that agentic AI is on my mind. I love to think about not only the opportunities for us as compliance professionals, but obviously our duty in terms of the responsibilities we have for the challenges and the risks. So let's talk a bit about agentic AI this morning. Let's start with this. What is agentic AI? It's not AI that just responds, it's AI that acts. And so this opens up a whole new era for us when it comes to what we can do when it comes to risk management and also opportunities. So agentic AI, instead of waiting for a prompt, these systems can plan, make decisions, and take steps on their own. And that's a big shift for us as compliance and ethics functions, where we've always been about human accountability and control. And there's some recent headlines that tell the story of how fast these things are changing. Banks are testing agentic AI to transform entire compliance workflows. In fact, Avalara just recently announced agentic tax and compliance agents. These are embedded directly into ERP, billing, and email workflows for real-time compliance. And so you think about this, you now have agents, functional agents that will prepare your tax return, file your tax return, check it for verification. All these things are starting to happen through agentic AI, and we've got a lot to catch up with. Regulators are also warning this week about autonomous collusion, so price fixing, algorithms making decisions that could breach antitrust laws. So all the things that humans could do and we try to keep up with, agentic AI is now being programmed and created to do at speed and at scale. And we need to think about what we want to do about this. And then tech risk leaders, they don't want the compliance officers being the office of no. In fact, I was at a meeting just this week where someone with an eye roll mentioned their responsible AI council and said, well, they never approve anything. And it was the joke in the room. Everybody laughed. But gosh, we don't want to be the butt of that joke where we're putting in things that we think are sensible guardrails based on our experience. A council is a good idea. A policy is a good idea. But it just becomes the joke at the end of the day because we haven't found a way to keep the business moving forward. So the question is no longer, is this coming? It's how fast we get ready. So let's talk about why this matters for us firstly as compliance teams. We're now operating in a world, to summarize, where AI can act on behalf of the company, not just analyze. Decisions can be made really quickly, faster than human review cycles. And honestly, I've always had trouble keeping up with human decision making, and now we've got to keep up with these agents. And then risk signals, the ones that we look out for, they can appear and disappear within seconds. So you've no longer got long databases of decision making that you can evaluate for risks and trends and patterns. So that means our governance models are going to have to evolve. We're going to evolve from monitoring people to monitoring systems that learn and act. What is the challenge for us? Accountability and explainability. What is the opportunity? Speed, scale, and insight that we've never had before. And I'm always talking about these, decision, useful, intelligent insights. So, okay, the risks in brief. We've got an autonomy gap. Who is responsible when AI acts? We've got a transparency gap. Can it explain why it acted? And probably an oversight gap. Do we even know what it did? Let's be fair. But okay, rather than freezing, as I like to say, glass half full, Hemmer always says the glass can be refilled. This should energize compliance teams so we can become the architects of intelligent guardrails. So get excited, compliance fellow professionals, because we've got a lot of work to do. And we don't want to be after the fact reviewers. We can't, whether we want to or not, we really just can't. So what's the upside? I always say, if you can, use a word 3 times, you can make it your own. Same with this, right? If you can use this opportunity 3 times yourself, you can make it your own. You can live and breathe the opportunity and the risks, have radical empathy for the people you serve. So think of compliance as a service. Agentic AI can help us reimagine ethics and compliance as a service experience, not just a reporting function. And, Matt, looking at the FCPA case, this is what we need, right? We need to not be an after the fact reporting function that's trying to figure out what's happening. We need to be in lockstep now with the business. So here's how. Opportunities, always on risk sensing. There is an opportunity now to have AI agents that scan contracts, messages, workflows in real time. I am on the board for Umini, which is a company that scans communications in real time and allows you to coach on what's happening in the communications between, for example, a salesperson and a customer. We do this not to punish, but to protect, this idea of coaching for compliance. You can spot real-time conflicts, bribery risk, data leakage. You can also see around corners in some respects. So, for example, we're thinking about insider trading. You might start to see people descend into speaking in code or high volume of conversations between a couple of desks. Now you can maybe see these things before they're about to happen. And we like to call that everyday integrity as a service. We talked about the personalized coaching. I like to say it can be a compliance coach in your pocket. We can proactively surface micro training, FAQs, or risk tips based on your role, your location, the current task. I'd like to see a future. You've heard me talk about this, where we've got ways for compliance, and I'm getting decision useful navigation for my journey, not someone else's. So, for example, I'm about to submit for a new vendor, pop up a 30-second due diligence check. That can be now done with agents. Automated issue triage and escalation. I am just trying to improve the way that we have a ticketing system at DocuSign for compliance, but I'm worried that I'm going to be a victim of my own success unless I automate the triage and the escalation and the routing of that. So agents are going to be part of that program. The other bugbear for me as a compliance professional is audit-ready documentation. This idea of an audit's come, now can you provide evidence for these things? We're doing this right now. I'd love to see agentic AI maintaining living audit trails. So capturing decisions, rationales, risk controls continuously. I click at the button, I've got the evidence for my auditors and whatever control they want to know about. And then we can move from being paper chasers, I hate using my team to just go look in files to pull out evidence. Instead, they can be insight interpreters. And then, let's not forget the human in the loop decision piece. We know this is important for a responsible AI governance. And I think, it was in the chat, we don't hand off judgment, right? So there's a lot that's going to be done in terms of decision making, but we have to design systems where humans approve and refine and learn from these recommendations. And so, look, to conclude, I could go on all day about this, so I'll keep it brief, but we now require something different, right? Agent supervisors, AI ethics coaches, trust data analysts, something which allows us to design the conditions for responsible speed. And I don't think of that as the brakes that stop you. I think of that as the brakes that help you navigate a turn swiftly. So think of the F1, think of the figure eight. The only way you're going to get around that turn quickly is with some responsible brakes, and that's what we need to be. So I'll close there, but love to hear some thoughts on how you're seeing this in action.
So for those watching this podcast or listening to it, our internal chat just blew up. So we're going to start with Matt, who may have a comment and or a question. What do you got, Matt?
Well, I have two examples, I think, of how we are not yet fully prepared to handle all of the risks for agentic AI. One of them is, I think, relevant to FCPA. The other one's going to come out from deep left field, but trust me, we are going to fall on our face for this at some point. So let's say you have an AI agent and you are in some sort of bizarro hackneyed joint venture like we just discussed, where you have majority control, but you don't have any visibility into the joint venture for whatever reason. And you casually mention to your AI agent, we need to get more visibility. What if the agent hacks into that joint venture systems? Because remember, this is software. It does not have a conscience. It is not ethical. It is sociopathic. It is going to do what you told it to do. I was told to get more visibility. I'm going to go get it. Could an AI agent do that today? Yes, it could. Do we have the right guardrails in place to make sure it wouldn't make that sort of unethical decision because it doesn't appreciate what that is? No, we don't. The second thing that I have been thinking about lately is one other thing that AI agents are going to be able to do, and the most advanced could do right now, is that they can program other agents to do certain tasks. So my thought, and this is from deep left field, is what's the accounting for our internally generated software? Because that's what your agent just did. It expanded the amount of internally generated software you have, and that could affect the valuation of your company. FASB just adopted a new accounting standard for internally generated software. And that can become a big decision when you are a tech company looking at M&A deals. Do you buy new tech? Do you develop it in-house? If the AI agent is developing more tech on its own, how are we accounting for that? Who is the chief decision maker, which is an issue stated in the standard? So are we going to say that an agent is now a decision maker for the company, which will probably leave the general counsel breathing into a paper bag? We have no answers for any of this stuff. However, I will bet my mortgage that we are going to wind up with a fact pattern figuring this out before the decade is done.
Mr. Marks, blow it up.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty slippery slope, and I think Matt's articulated a lot of this in his commentary. But if we're and agentic is just a fancy word for agent, right? So it acting as an agent. I think the good doctor mentioned that, but and she did mention the human in the loop, which is fine. But if we're using this to make judgments, and you don't have those guardrails, if there's not the four eyes principle, it's great that it identifies red flags, anomalies, or trends, or does super fast matching between things. It's not perfect. It just isn't, and sometimes it does weird, funky, crazy stuff. It hallucinates, basically. That's what they call them. They call them AI hallucinations. I just call it just getting old. But at the end of the day, if you don't have somebody verifying this data, and you don't know where this stuff is coming from, that's a huge problem. It's a huge problem on the litigation side anyway, because there have been cases already where people have done this without any verification. And I'm being oversimplistic here, but they've gotten skewed, and I mean in a really bad way. And so, I think if that's sort of the litmus test of what's going to happen internally if somebody starts to really just rely on these things without having those guardrails, I just think we're headed into a really ugly place. I do think there's a role for this. I do think it's useful. I do go back to everything that I believe in, and that is sources of truth, and making sure that the data that it's using has to be a source of truth. If it's not, that's problematic too. You don't know where it's pulling from. Again, I think that's a real bad, that could lead to really bad results. And so, if you can control it and containerize it, and there are people that are doing this now, and I just spoke about this at the AICPA's fraud conference a couple of weeks ago. I think it's going to happen. And there was a law firm that actually came out, and they have their own philosophy on all of this as well. But they're actually training their younger folks on. They're like, let's spend hundreds of hours on training our younger folks on how to use this more effectively. And I think, again, I think the doctor mentioned there's great uses for this. There certainly are, and gave some really good examples. But if this is not managed appropriately, and there's not good governance around this, it could be incendiary for a lot of us.
Lisa, what do you got for us?
Well, I mean, I think that it has been pretty well covered. Every time I thought I had a point, it was shared in here. But I do think that the management, the learning it, and primarily how is the rest of your business using some of these AI tools is a really important thing to keep in mind, because there may be additional compliance risks or other things there that you don't even know yet. Or it may be asking their, an agentic AI questions in a way in which they prompt so they can get the right answers. You don't even know if that's happening or things like that. I mean, I'm still easing my way into the world of this, but figuring out how, what use cases you have, and what you, again, for your companies, what your biggest risks are, and kind of trying to marry that together. And the last point I'll have is, this is something that, Matt, when you wrote about it this summer, was the Claude Anthropic sandbox, where I worry about things like this. It becomes an agent who may be able to go to whatever they think is the right government agency, state, federal, another country, if it believes you're doing something wrong. So this sentience and this agentic AI is there's just so much there that does require management, and to balance it with what Hema rightly says is, you don't want to be the Department of No, is going to be a challenge for us. So.
All right, we're going to move on to Mr. Marks, because this is a topic I've wanted to put to him for some time, and that is the NBA / Major League Baseball betting scandals, but from an internal controls perspective. What do you see as either lacking, needed, or didn't work?
Well, I had some time to think about this, but I was going to be a little bit clever in my opening comments, so I'm going to start with that. So I think it was back in the 40s, Warner Brother released one of the greatest Bugs Bunny cartoons of ever, and it was called Baseball Bugs. and Bugs played every position on the field. First base, Bugs Bunny. Second base, Bugs Bunny. Third base, Bugs Bunny. Outfield, Bugs Bunny. Pitching, Bugs Bunny. Catching, Bugs Bunny. Everywhere you look, there was Bugs. And then the announcer says, now batting the Gas House Gorillas. So if you thought that lineup was freaking crazy, wait until you hear what's going on in professional sports today. And Tom, I think you teed this up a little bit. But, these recent NBA and MLB betting scandals feel a little bit like that cartoon to me. Everyone is everywhere. Everyone is doing something they should not be doing. And the people who were supposed to be watching the game were not watching closely enough. And I'm going to get into this a little bit because I had some time to think. So let me shift to the real story. And to do that, I want to start with something basic, internal control. And, I had to make a believer out of Matt Kelly live and in charge when I offered somebody $100 to give me a definition of internal control. I still do that today. And I still have that same $100 bill in my wallet. But, a lot of people use the term, very few people define it correctly. And the definition that I use, which Matt was kind enough to publish, is it's an action or a process of interlocking activities that support the policies and procedures that we rely on to prevent, detect, correct, direct, and corroborate what should be happening in an organization. Or said another way, internal control is not paperwork. It's how we make sure things work in a way they're supposed to work. And let me be very clear, and I just said this, trust is not an internal control. And I tell that to people all the time. They're like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, that's a whole other podcast, and we can get into that later. But everything that happened in these scandals ties back to that point for me. Trust filled the gaps where control should have been. So here's what happened. The sports books were actually doing their job. They were monitoring these betting patterns, and I'll get into that in a second because it's interesting. They watched for unusual spikes. They saw concentrated wagers on very specific outcomes, and they detected things that did not look right. And they escalated these red flags to the leagues. The data spoke, right? And the red flags a red flag does not prove wrongdoing. I've said this a gazillion times. Everyone thinks a red flag means that there's fraud. That's not the case. So a red flag simply says, look a little closer. And here's where things, to me, fell apart. Logging a red flag is not the same as responding to it. It just isn't. Acknowledging a red flag is not the same as evaluating it. The control is what happens after detection. That's where the breakdown occurred to me in these particular situations. So now let's talk about the bet types at the center of all this. Many of them were prop bets, and I had no freaking idea what a prop bet was until I started reading all about this a couple of weeks ago or even months ago. So, a prop bet is a wager on a single event inside the actual game itself. So one pitch, one rebound, one substitution, one free throw, pick anything. They're micro events, and micro events are easy to manipulate. Now, as I'm going through this, think about your own organization. So this means that prop bets are high risk, right? So high risk activities require stronger controls. Very much similar to what Matt was talking about in the FCPA case, in a small revenue, maybe an insignificant thing, but a lot of high risk because of all these other factors, right? So high risk activities require stronger controls. We all know that. Enough to be said about that. Stronger analytics, for sure. Stronger triage, stronger escalation. That did not happen here. It just didn't. And that brings me to triage, which I've been hot on lately. A lot of organizations basically do not have a good triage process. They have these posters that they call ethics hotlines, and when somebody calls or sends an email in, it gets in there. But then what do you do after that? That's where things sort of start to break down. And I think that's really what happened here. Triage is what you do at the moment a red flag appears. And if you look at COSO or the ACFE, they're aligned on this. You capture the information, you assess it quickly, you determine the urgency, and you escalate the issue depending on the level of risk. Fundamental. It is structured. It is disciplined. It is documented, right? Tom likes the word document, so I'll say documented again. So what happened in these leagues was triage without depth. So in the NBA case, for example, the league saw unusual betting on a player. They talked to him multiple times, and then they cleared him. But the behavior continued until law enforcement stepped in. That tells me the assessment was not deep enough. My opinion. I don't know what happened. I wasn't there. I just don't know. The escalation was not strong enough, and the review relied too much on trust and not enough on evidence. Again, my opinion. In the MLB case, sportsbooks flagged patterns of single pitch outcomes. Eventually, law enforcement took over. but not before the scheme impacted multiple games. So a strong triage process maybe or probably would have elevated those early warnings a little bit faster, which I think we all love in our own environments today. So now let's talk about the data. This is where organizations often fool themselves. Data is a silent whistleblower. And somebody taught me that years and years and years ago. Data is a silent whistleblower. It doesn't get nervous. It doesn't hesitate. It tells you when something is wrong. So I have the book on my desk. I'm a huge fan of Yogi Berra. So I'm going to throw a Berraism in there for you, Tom. But Yogi Berra said, you can observe a lot by watching. And, these leagues did some watching. They did not do enough observing. So let me move to the lessons learned. Risk assessments, they must evolve. We've talked about this ad nauseum on this podcast and prior podcasts. When the sports betting environment changed, the fraud risk landscape changed with it. Risk assessments need to be updated constantly. I've said this again ad nauseum. It's not a set it and forget it environment. Controls only work when they're executed through the full life cycle. Detect, evaluate, escalate, document are all important. A single break in that chain is a full breakdown, literally. Monitoring and reporting failed at the handoff. The alert happened, the follow-up did not. So culture matters here too. Insiders in both leagues thought they can get away with it. When people believe controls do not apply to them, there's some sense of arrogance there. Controls collapse. And after any failure like this, you need a formal postmortem. So I'll get into my other, bully pulpit type of diatribe here. You need to do a structured root cause analysis. You ask what happened, why it happened, which conditions allowed this to happen, and which controls must change to keep it from happening again. So now let me give the audience some questions I think that every board member or compliance leader really need to lean into. And I'll only throw out a couple of them that I thought of today. And I actually haven't written down here, but because I can't remember everything. But, one is, do you actually understand your internal control environment or you just assume it works, right? 2 is, do you treat data anomalies with the same seriousness as a whistleblower report? I think they're 2 great questions. And then if I was going to get into some action steps, 1, I think, these leagues need to strengthen their triage process. They need to define it, train it, and test it. I don't know whether that was done. 2, invest in true data analytics. As I said, data is a silent whistleblower, but it only works if somebody is listening. So you could run data all day long, but if you don't look at it and analyze it properly, then, and you let it sit there and marinate, and again, we've talked about this before, it's almost worse than not doing anything at all. So I think that's another area. But before I close, and I know I've been kind of running on here, and I'm pretty passionate about this stuff, as you can all see, but I want to make one important point. The sports books, to me, I think did their job. They monitored the data, they raised the alerts, they communicated those alerts to the leagues. And the early warning systems were working on the outside. The breakdown happened on the inside, and that's governance. So if someone from Major League Baseball or the National Basketball Association is listening, here's my advice. Bring in independent professionals who understand fraud risk, internal controls, data analytics, and culture. Bring in people who know how to rebuild a fraud risk awareness program from the ground up. And if you need someone with almost 40 years of forensic experience that has helped organizations all over the world to strengthen their governance programs, I know a guy. So now let me close with one more Yogi Berraism, and I promise I'm done. He said, if you don't know where you're going, you're going to wind up someplace else, which is one of my favorite Yogi quotes. And that's exactly what happens in governance, compliance, and risk management. When you do not update your risk assessments, when you fail to monitor your controls and you fail to act on red flags, if you don't know where your program is going, you're going to wind up someplace else. And in today's world, that someplace else is usually on the front page of some magazine or in radical compliance. And so, since Thanksgiving is approaching, here are my last thoughts, right? I love Martha Stewart, by the way. So Martha Stewart can tell you the perfect time to serve your turkey, but only you can decide when to strengthen your fraud controls, hint. And so now, don't be a turkey about it. Pick up your fraud risk assessment, take a look at your controls, make sure that they actually work, make sure you have a good triage program, read, be a student of the game. Matt and Lisa and everybody on this podcast, we all write ad nauseum about this stuff. Read that. For me, I learn something every time I read something from Tom or Matt. I just do. It's great insight. We all have different perspectives on things. So thank you for listening. Stay vigilant, stay curious, and make your controls count. That's it. I'm out.
Emma Lomax, what you got?
I mean, mic drop first. I mean, amazing. I've got 1,000 hashtags from you. Thank you, Jonathan. Hashtag don't be a turkey, very festive. My mum used to have this thing on her desk that said, how can you expect to soar like an eagle if you hang out with turkeys? Like, what are we going to do about soaring like an eagle here? Yeah, the other hashtag was make it make sense. So when I responded to Matt's introduction on the FCPA case, I came in with, what else could be true, empathy. Here I'm going to go the other way, right? Hashtag make it make sense. What are we doing right now, right, when it comes to this? And what you talked about root cause analysis for the internal control, but I'm going to say root cause analysis for the problem here, right? What are we missing as compliance professionals? Governance is important. Let's take responsibility. Again, another thing for my mum, if you point one finger, there's 3 pointing back. So let's look at the 3 that are pointing back at us, right? Before we get to the players and the betting. One thing that I started to use, I hope I'm offering this as a potential solution, is something called the product mindset for compliance. Well, let's call it the product mindset for internal control. Think of your internal control as a product. And this comes from Spotify. It was a Spotify method. They said you need to think it, build it, ship it, tweak it. Now I add in a 5th: think it, build it, ship it, see it adopted, tweak it. This idea that you don't just build a control, ship it, and you think it's working. To your point, Jonathan, you said that very eloquently. This assumption that it's working. We have to have this product mindset of iteration, awareness, a goal in mind, right? And if we're doing that, and the see it adopted part is really important, which is why I add it in, which is you cannot just ship it out and say this control exists. And we know this. The guidance tells us we have to make sure our controls are effective. But I'm using this framework to drive that effectiveness, right? If you keep asking yourselves those curious questions, have I thought about this? How is it going to work in practice? How did I ship it? To whom? Which stakeholders are involved? How did I build it? How did I ship it? And then is it really being adopted? And, the whole stakeholder team could be the subject of attrition next month. So what are you going to do to make sure that this thing is adopted over and over again? And what are you, to your point about lessons learned, you're not testing the effectiveness if you haven't found something that's broken that you need to tweak. Right? The chances of you thinking, building, and shipping perfection, good luck with that, right? So this idea that if we start with this idea that we have a product mindset, we iterate. I'm lucky to work in tech because I'm surrounded by these tech geniuses that do this every day. So I'm taking inspiration from these product engineers that they don't expect to just think about it overnight and ship it. And I think, I don't want to be unfair, but we may be guilty of that in the compliance world. We just think as long as we check that box and sent out of control, we're good until audit comes and tells us something else. And I feel we need to design for success. So again, I'll pause there, but I could go on and on. Great presentation.
I love that. And, just to kind of overlay that a little bit, I take a more granular approach. I think yours is, I love that. I'm going to think about that some more. But like I use red flags as my to weaponize a control. And by that, I break down red flags into 4 distinct categories: data, documents, lack of controls, and behavior. And I look at all those red flags and I go, if this control is supposed to be designed and supposed to do something, or there's some activity, right? What am I going to get out of here that would make sense for me in order to ensure that this thing is going to be effective at the end of the day? And so it's if you take that mindset, it kind of flips the script a little bit, because I think a lot of times people are like, well, I need to review this. Well, that's great. When I look at policies or I look at procedures and someone says review this, to me that's just superficial. It doesn't provide any guidance whatsoever. So I think what you're saying and what I'm saying, if you can combine those, kind of like you put your chocolate in my peanut butter type of thing, I think it could be a lot better. So I want to think some more about that, but I like what you're saying. I really do. I think that's awesome.
All right, Lisa Fine. You got a high bar, Lisa.
I know.
What have you been thinking about?
Well, first of all, I would really like to say that next time I'm on this, I prefer not to be last, because it's hard to live up to everything so far. But with that in mind, the topic that you told me, which was perfect timing, is exactly what I'm thinking about, and probably slightly drier than some of this, is what are sort of some of the 3 big things I'm thinking about for coming up in 2026. So One of them will relate back significantly to some of the earlier parts of the conversation. Actually, they all will. But the first part is kind of two things related to one topic, which is the changes and deregulation by the U.S. government, increase what's going on in the U.S. states, and then the global overlay to it all. This is unprecedented in the last 5 years. It's become an overused word, but this is a new era for all of these things and how they work together and what you're looking at and how your company is suddenly looking at risk. Now, the people that are saying, does the FCPA exist? Does it not? Oh, they did something, that's great. But we still have these requirements. And I say a lot, like nature abhors a vacuum. If there's a vacuum in one area, like the way that if there's more deregulation by the federal government, you better believe that the states are going to step in from a US standpoint to do what they think is right and what they agree with, which means essentially now, instead of having some one thing that's overlaying it all, being as well as it, that may have some consistency, you're going to have states that are going on all different topics. In education, different states have different requirements for their textbook. That's our area, or testing or other things. And if a company is going to be looking at the New York or California regulations versus Florida, there's going to be a lot of differences and other things. And how do you best address what you need to do the right things while being able to follow these laws and understand it? I often talk a lot about the importance of basically being ethical, and at the end of the day, that if you have a rogue employee or something like that, that's your goal, because you've trained people right and you can't stop all wrongdoing. But I do think that's going to become a pretty huge deal, and just more and more with all of the different things that are going on generally in all these different governments. And then the second follow-up to that really is the global landscape and the context. Again, you have a lot of other countries that are out there that are regulating different things. I mean, there's the AI, the EU AI Act, which I am starting to learn more and more about. I spent a lot of time in the last year on the UK failure to prevent fraud laws, which kind of have a lot of points that we may be following already, but there are some other fundamental changes. And if you're a global company, should be knowing more about that. One of which is the idea that fraud, it's looking at what your company might be doing to get profits from fraud, whether accidental or not. It's putting it more like you need to have a program, the proactive program, in a slightly different way. And we have to think about that. And then there are other things, and that I also think is, for years and years, the FCPA, the U.S. dragged a bunch of countries along who may or may not have wanted to be that active in some of these anti-corruption things or agreed with our definition of it. But, and when I say our, I mean the U.S. But now, with the changes here, they've all put together infrastructures. Companies internationally are going to have been fined or penalized. And even now, when the one you're talking about earlier, obviously I know it's foreign by nature, but we're foreign now for some of these other countries that are going to be stepping up their enforcement. And that is something I think we all need to keep in mind from a US perspective. So those are kind of my first 2 points. My last one goes back to AI, but a little different than the way we focused on it. Obviously, we've talked a lot about agentic AI, but I'm thinking a lot about how do we use and not use AI tools as compliance professionals and in our programs. People are asking, I was doing this something earlier this week. I was talking about investigations, and several people said, well, what do you think about the note takers? And my view on that one is, oh no, we don't. First of all, I don't know if anybody's looked at a meeting summary before, but it can make mistakes, and those mistakes can turn into your admissions against interest. And even the ABA and others. I mean, that's one tool that people talk about. What can you do for policies? What can you do with other things that make sense? Does your company have a secure internal AI tool so that you can use it for certain types of research? I don't know the answers to all of this, and going back to how is your business using AI to make sure, for example, if somebody talks about, wow, it would be great if we could have answers, to what if can we get answers to some basic questions? And my view is on that, sure, if it's go to this place, go to that, here's where this information is, here's where you input something. What I don't want is somebody going in there, and I mentioned it earlier, with a prompt that comes out that is intended for them to get an answer that could avoid what their compliance requirement is, and for them to say, well, that compliance signed off on that. And I don't think any of us are fully ready for some of those things. And if you are, maybe let me know, because that'd be really cool to learn about. But I think that we have a lot to think about how we can effectively use AI as a function. And one last comment I'll make about that is, I don't think it's a bad thing to put your policies through there to see if they're readable and to see if they're summary. You don't want them writing a policy, again, I don't think, but I do think, there are places where I already can see where it will help, because I know for me, I will get into the weeds sometimes. And sometimes AI will write it with, several M dashes in a way that may or may not be more, it can help me fix what I'm doing to make it more user-friendly, but it is not that tool or the only tool. And I'm not a total Luddite, but I do think we have a lot to think about in all of those areas. So those are my three. And you all have talked about so many amazing things that you've just added onto my list significantly for 2026. So thank you for that. And I think those are mine. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts about those or things that you're keeping in mind in 2026.
All right. Well, that was great, Lisa. You certainly comported yourself well. But now we're on to fan favorites of shout outs and rants. We're going to ask Emma to go first because she's got a top of the hour commitment. So we'll do Emma Lomax, Matt Kelly, Jonathan Marks, Lisa Fine, and batting last, Tom Fox. So there you go. Emma, you have a shout out and or rant, although the great women call it something different.
What do we call it? A quickie? I don't know what we call it, but anyway,
rants or raves.
Rants or raves, yeah, that's right. Very short rant. The M dash. That's still my rant. Why are they doing that? Site code references too. What's going on? Fix that, please. My rave. I was recently at the Legal Tech Fund conference in Austin, run by Zach Posner, the Legal Tech Fund Summit. I will say, if you get a chance to hang out with the entrepreneurs that are designing the future of legal and compliance tech, together with the practitioners and the investors, it's magical. It's magical to be in that environment. So that's my very brief rave. Find a way to meet with the people that are designing the tech. I know a lot of you speak to your vendors about their future roadmap, but stay in lockstep with them, because you want to see around corners. You want to see what the priorities will be next year. We need to see what's happening when it comes to legal and compliance tech. So that'll be my rave for today.
All right, Matt Kelly.
Well, first, I'm just going to give a shout out to the M dash. Thank you. I think it's a perfectly fine piece of punctuation. And Winston Churchill was a great fan of the M dash when writing out his speeches. But actually, I am going to rant about something that I had ranted about before earlier this year. I think it was May or June, I was complaining about the Republicans in Congress trying to ban states from imposing AI regulations. Now, that was a terrible idea, as I said at the time. And eventually enough states rebelled and Democrats rebelled and even some Republicans rebelled that they killed that idea off. And now it is back again. This is still a bad idea, and we should not do this. There are currently two different things floating around, ideas in Washington, D.C. Number one is allegedly Donald Trump is going to come out with an executive order ordering the Justice Department to try and sue states for laws that regulate AI. We have not seen such an executive order. And honestly, I am not that worried about that one, because if he's asking the Justice Department to do something, given how incompetent they generally are right now and understaffed, I'm not that worried about it. They'll run around and they'll make some gestures and then nothing will happen. It wouldn't be the first time he signed an order telling them to do something and they didn't do anything. However, Republicans in Congress, like, for real, guys, you're going to do this again? Did you not hear all the complaints previously over the summer about how this is going to curtail states' abilities to enforce consumer privacy or anti-discrimination or fair labor or energy consumption and real estate development once we start talking about data centers? And did you not just see the election results we had in this country 3 weeks ago, where Republicans, in case you didn't see it, you got killed, you got clobbered, you got your butts kicked by nobody who wants any of what you are saying right now. Do not try to revive this bad idea and sneak it in again. Allegedly, they're going to sneak this into a defense spending bill. I suspect they're probably going to try and split the baby, where they say, if you want certain broadband development funds, you're going to have to not enforce your AI laws. I think there'd be a couple of different states who would say, fine, whatever, we're still doing it, keep your money. But we cannot let AI and the AI industry run unchecked all over all of our investor and consumer and legal protections we have. Let's not go through all of this again, because I'm willing to bet it'll end up in the same place as the first time, where Republicans look like fools and they have to do a climb down. It's what happened before. Maybe we do the right thing and not do it again.
Mr. Marks,
Yes, sir.
what do you got for us?
Shout out. I don't know if anybody knows her by her real name, but her name's Mackenzie Scott, and she's an author, philanthropist, and ex-wife of Jeff Bezos. And a shout out to her. She's I think at last count donated almost or over $19 billion to over 2,500 charities, 2,500 not-for-profits. And I think in entering the holiday season and the spirit of all of this, I think that's fantastic. Most recently, she donated $70 million to the United Negro College Fund, which I think is awesome. And she's just, I think she's trying to do all the right things. I just want to let her know, if she's listening, that cancer support community, we don't charge for our services. So if you're going to stroke a big fat check, I'd really love to get one from you. I admire who you are and what you're doing, and keep up the good work.
Lisa Fine.
All right. Well, I would like to rant about what's happened to my football team this year, which is the Buffalo Bills, but I can't to all the people on this call that will gloat about the fact that their teams are doing better. So,
Go Birds.
Yeah, well, yeah, fly Eagles fly. Buffalo Bills Mafias, back to our usual tortured selves. But separate from that, I wanted to sort of make a bit of a rave and also a shout out to the Compliance Week has just started their. Oh, really? I think we've got some insult to injury over there from Jonathan. But I wanted to say they're starting their Mind of the CCO survey, which, while I am not somebody who loves to do a lot of surveys or other things like that, and I know they come out, I think this one is significant, and I also think it's a really important time for us to let our views be known. And I think this is a really great tool to do so. So I wanted to basically, thank Erin, who's been continuing this, who I think has done a lovely job there, and also to basically, shout that out and remind people that it's out there.
All right. Well, I'm going to go in a very different direction today. I hope I can tie all this together. And my shout out is there are no new ideas ever anywhere. It started with a article, or a tidbit rather, from Matt Levine's Money Stuff, and I'm going to read it. I wrote yesterday about a public company chief executive who announced a plan to buy 690,420 shares of his company stock. Those are meme finance numbers. I wrote they have magic power. If you do stuff in units of 69 or 420, then your stock will go up. I got several emails from readers saying that I am old and out of touch, and now the meme numbers are 6 and 7. Is that true? As a father of elementary age children, I personally encountered the 6-7 meme far more than the 69 or 420, thank God. But presumably school children aren't buying the meme stocks. Elon Musk is 54 years old, and his memes are 69 and 420. Still, I suppose if you're a forward-looking meme stock CEO, maybe you do have to start doing stuff in units of 6 and 7. Now, I have validated that with perhaps the top journalist in compliance, Matt Kelly, who has Gen Alpha children. But my point is that this is not new. Playing with numbers has been around for a long, long time. I'm taking a deep dive into the book of Genesis. And I've always wondered about the ages of the patriarchs. So Abraham was 175 when he died. Isaac, 180. Jacob, 147. Now, in the Methodist Church, we were told that that just meant they were old. Well, it turns out those are memes, and those are numerical memes. Abraham at 175, that's 5 squared times 7. 2 squared times 3 squared times 5. And Jacob at 147, that's 3 squared times 7. So we've been doing this a long, long time. How old is Genesis? Well, it's purported to be written in 1400 BCE. But if you really want to go back, look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, written in 2100 BCE, and look at the numerical memes there. Let's start with wild man Enkidu, who was tamed to become a human after 7 days of raucous sex with a temple prostitute. And the flood that was originally talked about in Gilgamesh was not 40 days, but 7 days. And Gilgamesh himself was 3 parts, 2-part God, 1 part human. Where have we heard that before? So numerical memes have been around a long, long time. And I shout out to millennials, Gen Zs, Gen Alphas, and now Gen Betas for having the wherewithal to have their own numbers, not 69 and 420, but 6, 7. So, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I forgot to completely shout out to the quick ladies, Lisa Fine and Hema. Hema's had to roll off, but I wanted to thank you guys for coming on. As always, you all were great additions to our little gang. We're going to obviously be off for Thanksgiving week, but I hope all our listeners have a very happy, safe, and joyous Thanksgiving. We will be back in December, guys.
Thanks, Tom.